Hey, A-Pushers. So today we are starting on Nixon. So last we left Vietnam, LBJ was the president responsible for escalating the U.S.'s involvement in Vietnam. Prior to LBJ, Kennedy had just sent advisors to Vietnam, basically to help the South Vietnamese military fight their own battle. We just had advisors. We sent U.S. advisors there um, just to advise the South Vietnamese. But it was LBJ's decision to escalate, meaning that basically the United States would take over fighting this civil war in Vietnam between the North and the South Vietnamese people. And it started with Operation Rolling Thunder, and it was sustained bombing, right, of North Vietnam as well as Viet Cong, which was North Vietnam's presence in military presence in the South. And then that was in 1967. By 1968 and 1968, we had, of course, the Tet Offense. And the Tet Offense basically, even though it was technically a victory for the United States, it didn't look that way on television, and so political protest against the war in Vietnam escalated. And so at that point in 1968, we know that LBJ is going to choose not to run for a second term. And this is going to open the door for Nixon. Now, they're from different political parties, but at this point in time, after two terms with a Democrat, whether it was JFK or LBJ, I think the country was ready for a more conservative swing, especially because Nixon is going to campaign on ending the war in Vietnam. And so this is going to, and you're going to see far into the future, where LBJ began this road towards distrusting government. Certainly Nixon will put a nail in that coffin. All right, so LBJ Nixon is going to run in 1968 as a Republican. Now he had a long political career prior to 1968. Remember, he was the VP, Vice President for Eisenhower for two terms. He ran against Kennedy in 1960 and lost, right? And he decided to run again here in 1968, at a time in which the Democrats were very fractured and were very split, as evidenced by the 1968 Democratic National Convention that took place in Chicago and was a source of violence. So Nixon will win in 1968, and immediately the draft is activated in 1969 when he takes office. Now, what was his plan for ending the war in Vietnam? Well, it's called Vietnamization. Prior to this term, Vietnamization was called de-Americanization. So, in other words, let's go back to the way it was under Kennedy, where it would just be a bunch of American military advisors, right? Not where we're fighting the war for the South Vietnamese, but rather the South Vietnamese are fighting the Civil War with U.S. support. So Nixon Vietnamization is essentially a policy of withdrawing U.S. troops. There were 540,000 in 1969, and he's going to begin the process of reducing that number, but increasing U.S. money, weapons, and training to the South Vietnamese troops. So, as you can see here, this is basically U.S. is going to withdraw boots on the ground, but instead we're going to support the South Vietnamese with teaching them, training them, helping them, artillery, that kind of thing. Okay, so I want you to look at the map. And do y'all see this line going from North Vietnam into South Vietnam? This is called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And this was supplies that the North Vietnamese were sending to the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. The Viet Cong, of course, was in support of Ho Chi Minh and communism in Vietnam. So the Ho Chi Minh Trail were supply lines. And I don't know if you can see this, but the Ho Chi Minh Trail is going through Laos, which is a country, as well as Cambodia, right here. Which at the time, Cambodia was a neutral country. Laos did have communist leanings and communist government, but Cambodia here was neutral. So here's the thing about Vietnam, and this is what is so egregious about the whole Vietnam conflict. The reason we were there was so political. LBJ knew in 1965 when he inherited this problem, he knew this was an unwinnable war. But in order to make the Democrats appear tough on communism, because remember, Republicans had seized that mantle of being tough on communism, and in opposition, the Democrats appeared soft on communism. So when LBJ became president, he kind of wanted to appear tough on communism. So even though Vietnam was not a winnable war, and everyone knew it, top military advisors knew that, LBJ decided to escalate. Well, Nixon's in the same boat. This is not a winnable war, but we got to end this thing. So even though he campaigns on Vietnamization, withdrawing U.S. troops, pulling out of Vietnam, but with honor, he was very big on we can't just abandon, we have to have peace with honor. In the back doors, right, where, out of public eye, Nixon tells his military leaders to go ahead and invade this neutral nation of Cambodia in order to bomb the supply lines going through Cambodia. Because the way to weaken the enemy in North Korea was to weaken the Viet Cong. And the way to weaken the Viet Cong is to end supplies going to the Viet Cong. So, so we invaded Cambodia. And by all accounts, it was relatively successful, but there's going to be tremendous fallout from this. When he campaigns on pulling us out of Vietnam, and then all of a sudden, word gets leaked to the press that wait, he's just invaded Cambodia. Wait, this is not withdrawal of U.S. troops. This is escalating our involvement in this conflict. So as you can imagine, all hell broke loose. Right here is the reaction to the Cambodia invasion was student protests all over the place. You may have heard of the very famous Kent State massacre. So Kent State is a university in Ohio, and there was a peaceful protest against the Cambodian invasion on the campus of Kent State. Now, no doubt, the crowd who was peacefully protesting were heckling the National Guard that was standing guard, and at some point, despite sense, the National Guard fired into the crowd of college students who were protesting, killing 4, wounding 7. I'm going to show you, I think this is a famous pictures right here of what is known as the Kent State Massacre. This was at the bottom is an award-winning Nobel Prize or a Pulitzer Prize winning photograph. So, and Kent State wasn't the only one. This is just the example I'm using. Jackson State College in Mississippi also had a protest against the Cambodian invasion where police fired into a student dormitory, killing 2. As a result of the big the hullabaloo, Nixon will withdraw U.S. troops from Cambodia, although it was a success. But, this happened behind closed doors. Even Congress didn't know about the Cambodian invasion. So Congress moves to repeal the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that had given LBJ a blank check to do whatever he felt was necessary without any congressional approval. Well, Congress is increasingly becoming distrustful of the executor, whether it was LBJ or now Nixon. And so they repeal the Gulf of Tonkin. But then, Nixon then invades Laos. Now, it's not boots on the ground. Basically, it was an air attack. It was providing air and artillery support to the ARVN, also known as the South Vietnamese military. It was this invasion of Laos was a big deal. It was codenamed Operation Lam Son 719. And this one did not go as well as the Cambodian invasion. As a matter of fact, it ends in defeat. Increasing distrust of the executor. As you can see here, a lot of protest movements taking place. All right, Nixon will run. Despite all of this, he will run for a second term in 1972. And he's going to kind of play the same game he played in 1968, which was appealing to what was known as the silent majority. So, who were the silent majority? And no doubt you guys are going to hear reference to this term throughout your lives if you follow politics or if you don't live under a rock. The silent majority refers to that older generation, most likely the Joes and Rosies. Remember, the protesters were Jenny and Forrest, their kids. So the silent majority were the older generation who, much like in World War II, supported the war, supported the government, were more traditional, more conservative, and that's who Nixon is going to appeal to. And they come out to vote for him. His vice president, Spiro Agnew, also attacked the Jenny and Forrest, the hippies, the counterculture, calling them nattering nabobs of negativism because they're always so negative, protesting everything, right? And so he will win re-election in 1972. By the way, we haven't gotten to this yet because we're sticking to foreign policy right now, but Watergate has already broken. And so despite Watergate, Nixon does win re-election. All right, a little bit about the war as it continued from 1968 to 1970. Troops in Vietnam, yes, they're getting reduced, no question. He is pulling U.S. troops out of Vietnam, but those troops that are in Vietnam are disproportionately non-white and poor. And that's largely because there were a lot of dispensations for those who went to college. So if you were enrolled in college, in other words, could you pay tuition to college, then you were exempt from the draft. Remember, the draft was instituted in 1968. Let's see. Also, because there was a lot of protest among the nattering nabobs of negativism, the 26th Amendment is passed. You can die for your country, but you can't vote. The voting age at the time was 21, but in 1971, the 26th Amendment was added to the Constitution, lowering the voting age to 18. So speaking of distrust in government, something else happened right before the 1972 election in the summer of 1971, and that is the release of the Pentagon Papers. So what were the Pentagon Papers? Well, apparently back in the mid-1960s, the government, again distrustful of Johnson, the government did an investigation into the things that drew us into the war in Vietnam. Like, why is it that we're there? How do we get to be involved in Vietnam? And so this was an extensive government study. And then it was tabled, right? It was just kind of put in the archives somewhere. No one ever saw it until a CIA operative, or actually, I'm not sure if he was CIA. He worked for the government. He worked in the Pentagon. I'm not exactly sure if it was for the CIA, but he worked in the Pentagon, so he worked in defense. His name was Daniel Ellsberg, and Daniel Ellsberg came across this study that pointed out evidence of the mistakes and lies that Truman had made, mistakes and lies that Eisenhower had made, JFK, and most notably LBJ, including all that Gulf of Tonkin nonsense that was misleading. So it evidenced all of this. And so Daniel Ellsberg said, well, the American people ought to know. He's kind of like the Snowden, right, of the 1970s. And Daniel Ellsberg leaked this study to the New York Times. And of course, it made the U.S. government look really bad. Like the government's hiding things from the American people. So this is going to double down on the U.S.'s distrust in government. Now, it doesn't implicate Nixon because the study had been done in the 1960s, but it does make government look bad. And there's already protest against government for U.S. involvement in Vietnam. So Nixon wants to discredit Daniel Ellsberg as being some sort of lunatic who didn't know what he was talking about. So Nixon had employed, and yes, this is all sketchy and illegal, Nixon employed a group of White House team specialists that were code-named the Plumbers because they fixed leaks. And so the Plumbers were ordered to go to Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to pull Daniel Ellsberg's file, just to basically release it to say that he's a nut job, because he goes to a shrink. So the reason I'm bringing all this up is because A, continuing distrust in government. 2, this is all everybody was talking about in 1971. And 3, this is the road to Watergate. The Plumbers will be used in Watergate And of course, that is going to blow up. Okay, so we've been talking about how various presidents had different names for their foreign policy. Remember, Truman was containment, and Eisenhower was brinkmanship, and JFK and LBJ were flexible response. Well, Nixon is going to be détente. So détente is kind of a reversal of all those other policies. It was, let's ease Cold War tensions. Let's not escalate Cold War tensions. Let's not go to the brink of nuclear annihilation. Let's not use conventional weapons like inflexible response in order to be the bully of the world, right? Let's ease Cold War tensions. Let's take a collective breath. Let's resolve problems through diplomacy, right? Détente, easing of Cold War tensions. And Nixon was able to get away with this because he had such a reputation of being anti-communist. Remember, he made his reputation as a member of HUAC, going after Alger Hiss. So he was like the poster child for anti-communism, being tough on communism. So I think it was only Nixon that could have effectively done détente and not be branded some softy on communism. So that's the thing about Nixon. All Nixon cared about was foreign policy. As a more conservative, he believed that presidents shouldn't really be doing a whole lot in terms of domestic policy. That's up to the states to run government, but the president's job really is in foreign policy, kind of the complete opposite of what we saw with LBJ, who really had a strong domestic agenda and really didn't know very much about foreign policy. Nixon was the complete opposite. And here's the thing that Nixon knew. There was growing tension between the Soviet Union and China. And you would think that, oh, they're both communists, they must be BFFs. No, they were not. The Soviet Union and China had two different brands of communism. Soviet Union obviously not really being communistic, rather a totalitarian state, whereas China at least attempted true communism under Mao. And it was just under Mao. Subsequent leaders of China kind of moved away from the ideology of communism, where Mao held on to it very strongly. But these two countries are emerging as being, significantly powerful, and they're starting to clash. And so, because they are clashing with each other, Nixon sees an opportunity. Hey, let's continue to play one against the other in order to pressure both of them into North Vietnam coming to the negotiation table with the United States. So both Moscow, meaning Russia or the Soviet Union, and Beijing, meaning China, both of them had a hand in helping the North Vietnamese. China way more so than the Soviet Union. And if we played one against the other, like becoming, saddling up real close and, blinking our eyes ever so femininely, right, to both, we're hoping that we will essentially start to play one against the other. For example, so we wanted to get an invite to China. No American president had been to China. And again, China is communist, but Nixon was like, nah, I can handle this. I can go to China and play nice with China and not be branded as, a communist sympathizer. So this is Nixon's going to send his Secretary of State, brilliant guy, ethically questionable, but brilliant guy, Henry Kissinger, to meet with the Chinese and with the North Vietnamese. And so they met in Beijing, and they said, okay, we need to open the door for the U.S. president to meet with the Chinese premier, Mao Zedong. So the way they decided to do that was through ping pong. All right, more on that in just a second. And so the whole point being is that if Nixon goes to China, then the Russians are like, hey, wait a minute, why are the Americans and the Chinese cozying up? We want to cozy up with the Americans too. And then we could try and pressure both China and the Soviet Union into pressuring the North Vietnamese to come to negotiation tables. So that was the ploy. And step one of this master plan was called Realpolitik. Realpolitik is basically where we all say, you know what? There are five major powers in this world, five major global powers: the U.S., the Soviets, Western Europe, right, China and Japan. And we collectively should basically be responsible for world peace and to police the rest of the world. And so, this idea that there are five major powers and that we are responsible for world peace is called realpolitik. So, we're setting the stage for detente, right? Easing of Cold War tensions. Let's work with the Soviets. Let's work with the Chinese, right? We're all on equal ground, right? Easing of Cold War tensions, not pitting one against the other, which, by the way, was probably what we were trying to do it behind closed doors. So how do we get that door to open to China? Ping pong. So the Chinese, as you all know, are very, very good at ping pong. The Americans are very, very not good at ping pong. So so what Kissinger is able to do is to get the Chinese to invite the U.S. ping pong team to play in China, knowing that the American team will lose tragically to the Chinese. The Chinese will feel really good, they feel great about themselves, and this could be followed with an invitation for Nixon himself to go to China. And it worked. In July 1971, Nixon announced he accepted an invitation to China. And in February 1972, Nixon travels to China. And the result of here, Nixon meeting with Mao, is called the Shanghai Communique, where both nations agreed to normalize their relations. And here's the big one, and this has been in place ever since. Remember how we never recognized China? Remember China was really Taiwan in the United Nations? Well, we backtracked. We said, okay, there is only one China, and that one China is mainland China. It's not Taiwan. Taiwan is not China. And so it's called the One China policy. There is only one China, and that is Mao's China. Okay, so when you hear the term One China policy, that means that we recognize only one China, even though Taiwan to this day um, uh, insists they are China. No one recognizes that, including the UN. All right, so as a result of Nixon going to China, of course, the Soviets are like, hey, Nixon, come travel to Russia. Let's meet in Moscow. Let's also, under realpolitik, let's all, make some deals. So Nixon goes to Moscow and meets with Brezhnev, who was at the time the Russian premier, and they signed what is known as the wheat deal. So what was that? It was an exchange where the U.S. would agree to sell to the Soviets over $1 billion in wheat to feed the Russian people. Here's the big thing with Russia. They're basically an ice cube, and they can't grow their own food. Now, the United States, on the flip side, are huge overproducers of food, so match made in heaven. So we would sell our wheat to the Russians in exchange for helping us struggling farmers with surplus wheat. The farmers would make money, the Russians get fed, it's all good. This deal is also going to open the door to U.S. technology. So U.S. oil drilling technology was far superior to that of the Russians. And so we would be able to, in the future, sell oil drilling equipment to the Soviets to help them develop their oil fields that were in Siberia. And as a result of the wheat deal, Russia became more cautious in promoting communist revolutions in third world countries. And they did help get North Vietnam to the bargaining table. All right, and so this is going to open up the door. Again, the wheat deal will open up the door for other deals. Like I said, the oil drilling equipment, but also we and the Soviets meet in Helsinki. And here we discuss arms control. It's called SALT 1, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. And so this talk between the United States and Russia was basically to cool down the arms race, right? The weapons arms race. And this was the first agreement to place limits and restraints on the most important armaments. So there were these things called anti-ballistic missiles, and you can see a picture of one there. And this was what was limited. It was limitations placed on anti-ballistic missiles. All right, so what are anti-ballistic missiles? So there's these things called ICBMs. I take it back. What you see here on the picture is an ICBM. So an ICBM is an intercontinental ballistic missile. And basically that means that a missile will get launched on the launch pad, and on the head of the missile could be anything like a nuclear warhead. And so when it launches up, it goes over the polar ice cap and lands according to some mathematical trajectory on a target. And it would blow up, and it would be a nuclear bomb. So, because both us and the Russians had ICBMs, we developed what are known as anti-ballistic missile systems. And these are surface-to-air missiles that would, when an ICBM was deployed and it was still going over the polar ice cap, the anti-ballistic missile would shoot that nuclear warhead out of the sky. So it would detonate in the sky, it would never have a chance to land. So the SALT I agreements were limitations on those anti-ballistic missiles. All right, now, the point was really moot because behind closed doors, both us and the Russians had what are known as MIRVs, the multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles. So what does that mean? That was designed to overcome the anti-ballistic missiles. For example, so do you see how here this is an ICBM, but instead of one nuclear warhead, look how many there are. Right, all those little peaks, that's a different nuclear warhead. And so when it's up in the atmosphere, all of those nuclear warheads would deploy in different directions. So an anti-ballistic missile can only get one of them, right? So you still have like 4 or 5 nuclear warheads headed for their targets. So SALT I was essentially a moot thing, but it was a step in the right direction where we began to limit, right, all this nuclear stuff. So both us and the Russians had developed their own MRVs in order to compete with the U.S. And here we see Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet premier, going and visiting Nixon in the White House in 1973. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here, and then I will get into the Middle East next video. Stay safe, guys.